Namaste and welcome to Chiti Media's Current Affairs show. I am your host for today evening, Shreya Agarwal. I'm a lawyer and a journalist. And joining us today for our talk on hijabs, the Uniform Civil Code, and much more is Mr. Sanjay Dixit. He is an advocate, a retired IAS officer, the author of three path breaking books Krishna Gopeshwara, Krishna Yogeshwara, Unbreaking India, and the founder of the extremely popular The Jaipur Dialogues. Welcome to the show, Sanjay ji.
Namaste, Namaste Shreya ji.
Namaste.
Honored to be
Namaste.
here.
It is such a pleasure to have you here, Sanjay ji.
Thank you.
So, Sanjay ji, today we want to delve into the hijab controversy which has come up to the Supreme Court from the Karnataka High Court and ask you to throw some more light on the matter from different points of view. To give a brief background about the issue, it is basically that the Indian Supreme Court has been recently adjudicating on whether religious clothing can be permitted in a government institution in a secular setup in light of whether female students can be permitted to wear hijabs in colleges and schools where uniforms are prescribed. Can you tell us a little bit more about the practice of wearing hijabs and whether there are verses in the Quran prescribing it?
Okay, the last question I take first. There are no verses that prescribe wearing of hijab in the Quran, so that's taken care of. Because the ones that were cited, because in the Supreme Court that hearing is not online. You cannot see that hearing, but in the Karnataka High Court, that entire hearing was online, and you could watch all the proceedings and you could watch all the arguments, and they were also covered extensively. So the whole issue is not really about the right to freedom of religion. The whole issue is boiled down to whether it is permissible for an institution to prescribe uniforms and regulate clothing. That is basically the issue. And that is the reason, if you are following the hijab debate that is going on right now in the Supreme Court, then you would find that it was initially framed, at least in the Supreme Court. I will also come down to the order of the Karnataka High Court, how it looked at the entire issue. Okay, let's start with the Karnataka High Court decision first. First of all, this hijab is basically something that's defined in various manners.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be the hijab that is worn mostly in the West, is a cloth that is basically used to cover the hair on the head and the little bit of the front portion. That's about all. But hijab is also taken to mean the complete cloth, complete covering of the women, the kind that you see in Afghanistan and also in parts of North India. That is basically burqa. And burqa is also being treated as hijab in this Karnataka incident. So the factual matrix is that it was never an issue that if you wore hijab outside and if you wore hijab to places you went to on the street, nobody ever objected. But the issue was actually blown into a full controversy by the PFI, and their hand in this controversy is quite visible. And they do that, that is because it is basically an Islamic teaching. It is prescribed 9.120. That is the teaching of the Quran that says that the more you harass the non-believer, the more credit you get into your account that will be counted for your entry into the Jannat. So this is Surah At-Tawbah 120, 9.120. It is supposed to be a virtue to harass the non-believer. So how do you harass the non-believer? That is why you'll see that there's never any end to any demand. If you concede one, something new will come up. If you concede two, the third will come up. So far, so much so that even during the partition, after the partition, one of the architects of the partition, especially the East Pakistan, Hussain Shahid Surawardi, he's on record having said that. I've documented it in my book, Unbreaking India. He said that Pakistan is not our last demand. It is only our latest demand. So once you concede one demand, something else will come up. So Karnataka government, I must appreciate that they put their foot down right in the face of the first major confrontation that these PFI chaps brought up, and that was to wear hijab to uh, educational institutions that prescribed the uniform, and that in that prescription they excluded the hijab purposely because that really and did not go with the uh, culture of that place, Karnataka. So they came up with this petition, number of petitions they came up with, and they basically brought in three arguments. One was right to freedom of religion, Article 25 of the Constitution. And the second was the right to freedom of expression, Article 19A. And the third was, of course, the right to equality, that basically didn't seem to make much sense. They didn't argue too much on that. Basically, they first argued on the freedom of religion, but then the problem with the freedom of religion, they also distinguished actually because freedom of religion could not take them very far. If you read Article 25 of the Constitution of India, then it says that that article it begins with the article. If I'm trying to recollect from memory, so maybe a few commas, full stop here where they may go wrong. It says the subject to morality, health, public order, and subject to other rights prescribed in this part. This part means part 3, in which all the freedoms come. Part 3, fundamental rights. So, subject to other fundamental rights. So, that places the right to freedom of religion in the Constitution of India on a secondary pedestal. So, right of religion is actually subject to exercise of all other fundamental rights. If it comes in the way of exercise of other fundamental rights, then right of religion will have to take a subservient position. That is what is the prescription is in the uh, scheme of the constitution. So when they argued on that, then since whenever you talk of freedom of religion and how do you prescribe religion, then there is this test which is prescribed in one of the very old judgments, the 7 judge judgments called Shirur Mutt judgment. And the Shirur Mutt judgment, what is freedom of religion relates to what is essential practice of a religion. Everything cannot be made into an essential practice of a religion. And those essential practice of religion is, as far as Islam is concerned, is considered to be their 5 fundamentals, what is called the Tawheed, Namaz, Hajj, Roza, and Zakat. These are supposed to be the 5 fundamental principles. And then there are categories of rights within the Muslim law. Muslim law itself is a well postulated law in India because right from the British times it has been discussed, and it is almost settled. The law is almost settled. Settled by a number of times by Privy Council, by the House of Lords, then the Supreme Court. And it is well settled that something that is not an essential practice to a religion, that is not necessary to be granted as freedom of religion. Moreover, there's also Article 25 too. But Article 25 gives full right to the government to carry out actions for social reform in matters that are more economic or social and of such characters that are not necessarily intrinsic to religion. And if you look at Islam, that Islam basically tries to cover every aspect of your existence. So there's very little spirituality in it. Most of it is mm, related to a practice of your uh, outward conduct. It is regulating your outward conduct most of the time. Therefore, the court did not find much force in the arguments that were being given, and that time they changed tack and then they went to the freedom of expression part. Also, when we're talking about hijab, basically they were relying on uh, two ayats of the Quran. One was 24.31 and the other was 33.59. So in 24.59 and 33.5 and 24.31 and 33.59, in both of them, the word hijab did not occur. And even there, it was more recommendatory in nature. 24.31, they used the term khimar. So khimar is an outward covering that doesn't amount to hijab. It doesn't necessarily mean you cover up your hair. And 33.59 talks about jilbab. The term hijab is used in the Quran. It's used about 4 times, but in each of those cases, it is actually a physical curtain between two people. So much so that even talks about a hijab between the angels and Allah. So that is how people made fun of these arguments. I mean, these arguments were going on day-to-day basis, so people made fun of these arguments. What kind of hijab are you talking about? There is a hijab even between Allah and His creation, and even the angels have to meet Allah through the hijab. So that doesn't have a head covering at all. And a lot of other scholars, people like Arif Muhammad Khan and other progressive scholars, they all trashed these arguments. And legally also, they could not prove that hijab was an essential practice of religion. Then in the Supreme Court, when they were arguing, then the advocate actually conceded that even the 5 essential practices are not compulsory. Then the court asked them, then if even the 5 essential practices that are generally taken to be intrinsic to Islam, that I said that Tawheed, that is oneness of Allah, namaz, roza, zakat, and hajj. If even these are optional, and the punishment for not observing for them is actually to be given on the last day of judgment, then how do you sit in judgment and then pronounce your verdict here? Then they completely shifted tack and they came to the freedom of expression part. And the freedom of expression part, of course, there was a hilarious bit of argument in the Supreme Court. This freedom of expression part was also trashed by the Karnataka High Court, that said that freedom of expression is not an absolute right. You know, the freedom of expression given in 19(1)(a) is actually in Article 19(2). There are reasonable restrictions provided for the exercise of the freedom of speech and expression in Article 19(1)(a), and there are as many as 9 of them. Yes, several of them in integrity, sovereignty of India, the, what is called contempt of court, public order. All these factors are there. Relations with the other countries, things like that. In fact, it has the maximum number of reasonable restrictions, and that is one right that during emergency it can be taken away, completely taken away. So on both these counts, the and the settled law that was there, especially in the already extant law, five-judge bench in the Shabarimala also had ruled this way. So, on the basis of precedent, on the basis of the arguments advanced, the court, and the basis of judgments like Shirur, what the essential practice principle. Basically, when you determine the right to religion, the right to freedom of religion, then this essential practice concept comes in. On that, that whole thing was rejected, and then in the Supreme Court they were talking about the freedom of expression. That okay, this is dressing is part of our freedom of expression. And there's also a law that freedom of expression also includes the freedom to remain quiet. So the bench asked whether the freedom of dressing also includes the freedom to undress. And I think that actually was the end of that argument. So we can pretty well see where the argument is going right now in the Supreme Court. So that hijab debate, basically, according to me, is dead. It doesn't have much legs to stand on. And the only thing now these people are trying to take that debate, and they're saying that okay, that please club it with the Shabarimala review case, which is posted to a 9-judge bench. And
Yeah.
now they're trying to wriggle out of the division bench, which is hearing this. I don't know whether they will actually accede to their request or not, or they will pronounce the judgment and they'll say that there's no need to refer it to the larger, to the constitutional bench, the 9-judge bench. So that sort of sums up the hijab debate as it stands.
Right. So, thank you so much for the insight, Sanjay ji. You have covered a lot of the questions that we had wanted you to answer. Uh, One thing which we would like more light on is for the viewers, if you could tell us exactly what constitutes an essential religious practice and what are the factors that the court has laid down for determination of a particular practice as an essential religious practice or not.
Actually, on that, the jury is out because in Shabarimala, they said that as far as the Hindu practices are concerned, then they used Article 25, and using Article 25, they said that the right to equality prevails over the right to freedom of religion. So the mm, distinction that was being made uh, to the women of the menstruating age, that was discriminatory, and then they struck down that particular clause that had been in practice in that particular temple, the Ayyappa temple at Shabarimala, from times immemorial. Then the controversy arose because that particular petition was made by people who were not actually practicing Ayyappa devotees. They were Muslims, basically, and they had done that for ulterior motives. Then in the review, uh, they posted it because the argument was made very forcefully that there is also Article 26, and Article 26 is the only one that provides group rights in the Constitution of India. And that
Yeah.
is the only departure from the Western framework. The Constitution of India basically is a copy paste from the Western constitutions. Article 26 is the only one that gives uh, rights to groups. Now, the term used in the Constitution in Article 26 is denomination. Now, denomination has a certain meaning within the Western lexicon. And in India, we have sampradayas. We don't have what is called the denominations. And the prevailing view of the Supreme Court has been to deny the sampradayas the same rights as the denomination, so that the denominational rights of the the Christian churches and uh, Muslim sects are better protected.
Yeah.
The essential principle of essentiality is very well documented and defined as far as the Christians and the Muslims are concerned. But it remains quite foggy as far as the Hindu rights are concerned, mainly because of this, I should say, the confusion between the denomination and sampradaya. See, in the Hindi uh, version of the constitution, which is a translation, the original happens to be in English. So the denomination is translated as a sampradaya. Now, sampradaya in the Indian context has a completely different meaning. So that is why you have this nine-judge bench coming up. Basically, it is to uh, define or re-look at the Shirur Mutt judgment, the seven-judge judgment. I think it came in 1954. And what has been happening is this essentiality principle, as far as the Hindus are concerned, that it has been happening case by case. And a lot of major judgments have arisen because of this. As I said, as far as the Christians and uh, Muslims are concerned, it's fairly well defined. Though, of course, the right of women to go to mosques is still uh, being adjudicated, going to be adjudicated in this nine-judge bench. That is one of the matters that is referred there. Then for Parsi women as well. So whether these are essential matters. Now the Hindus are stressing that unlike the Abrahamic religions, in a temple is not a place of congregation. The temple has a deity, and that deity is a living being, and the deity has rights. And those rights are enunciated through the agamas, and that is what Article 26 is all about. So there's that whole reinterpretation is going to take place. Keshavananda Bharati case, for instance, the one of the biggest, most celebrated cases, also came out of the dispute on this rights of a mutt, and that is where that basic structure principle was enunciated. So, if you ask me in one word, what are the essential religious practices? I would say that the answer to this is that the essential religious practice is one without which that religion loses its meaning. And as we say, that it is well defined as far as the Christians and Muslims are concerned, because they have that one book which defines certain things. But because there is so much of diversity within the Hindu community, it generally goes from case to case.
Right. Thank you so much for that insight, Sanjay ji. Sanjay ji, my next question to you is that so hijabs or the wearing of head covers as a practice is in different forms. It can be seen in various other religions as well. For instance, in Rajasthan, there is a practice of women wearing sporting ghungats, or several such other practices can be seen in other religions or in other communities as well. So, what is your take on the fact that if a woman or a man wants to sport a particular uh, head cover, or carry a particular kirpan, or carry any kind of religious clothing, then what kind of protection can the state afford or not afford to such practice or such choice? I would say.
No, as I told you, that right to freedom of religion is a secondary right in the scheme of fundamental rights. So it has to be subordinated to, as I said, as it is enunciated in the article itself, to morality, to health, to public order, and to other fundamental rights.
Right.
So within that compass, you can have your freedom of religion. As far as Ghungat is concerned, it is not a religious practice at all. It is followed when I came to Rajasthan first in 1987. In the villages, it was very common. Now we see that it is not so common because it is basically it's come out of uh, I should say, if you trace the practice back, then it is basically a response to invaders
Yeah.
who uh, were who used to treat women as what is called malya ganimat, or proceeds of plunder, and then they used to carry them off, and then they used to make them sex slaves, and then they used to take them to the markets in Central Asia and Afghanistan and used to sell them off. That practice was so rampant that people used to hide away their women folk. And one of the practices that they evolved to avoid that was ghungat, the other was child marriage. So all these were behavioral responses to the conditions that prevailed then. And now they are receding because they do not carry a religious sanction. It is just out of, one says that, okay, mm, out of respect, for instance, when you go to a temple also, you cover your head, whether you are male or female.
Yeah.
But even that is voluntary. If you don't want to, you don't do it. If you sit in a puja, then you mm, try and cover your head. So it is just that. It has absolutely no parity with uh, what the Muslims claim is part of their religion. Nobody has ever claimed Gungat to be part of the religion. So that is a
Right.
huge difference.
That's a that's a very very important point that you have brought to the fore, Sanjay ji. Uh, I would move on to my next question, which is that according to you, what role, if any, does the complete separation of religion and the complete separation of religion and the state play in socio-economic development of a nation state? Yeah.
See, the problem is that when we use the term religion, you use it very loosely. And we tend to cover the Sanatana Dharma also with the term religion. Now, Sanatana Dharma is not religion, we know that. In fact, I have written, in fact, I'm in the process of writing a full book on it. It says that all religions are not the same. But I've clarified right at the beginning that I am using the term religion only because people understand Hindu Dharma abroad also as a religion. Though it doesn't have those trappings of religion. It is what is called, a lot of it is uh, uh, from inspiration of the self, because it is inward looking. It is not outward looking, unlike the Abrahamic religions. And of course, it doesn't have one book and one prophet and one code and one leader. It has a library. It doesn't have one book. And even the uh, Paramatma is divided into a trinity here with they perform different functions, and it has separate layers. Oh, that's okay. If we go into that, that will be a whole new debate. So, but the secularism as it is practiced in the West was required because the church was basically assuming the role of the king. In India, the Dharma Danda has always been above the Raj Danda, as we know. Even if you read Chanakya Niti, which is a codified book of statecraft, even there you would see that what it says about the Rajaniti. Rajaniti, as it says, Anvikshaki, Trayi, Varta, and Dandaniti. These four, they constitute statecraft. So even there, Trai is there. Trai means Vedas. So there in Sanatan Dharma, the Dharma as a moral precept is intrinsic to Rajaniti. Therefore, when they put the word secularism into the Indian context, it wasn't really necessary because the Sanatan Dharma is intrinsically secular in the sense that it treats everybody equally. Unlike Islam, which has the concept of zimmis or the second class citizens, or non believers as people who are destined to hell, or in Christianity, where you have heathens who are again destined to hell only for the grave sin of being non believers. There has never been any discrimination on the basis of belief in the either in the Sanatan Dharma or throughout the history of Bharatavarsha. So this debate, when it came up in the Constituent Assembly, whether we needed to put that word secular, it was actually this Constituent Assembly. It did not pass because they said that we simply do not have the kind of situation that prevailed in the West. The West needed to uh, differentiate between the church and the state so that the church did not continue to meddle with the state. And you have to look at the unique problems that Europe was facing just before the Treaty of Westphalia. The Treaty of Westphalia was a result of these struggles, and that is why they brought in this what is called secularism. But this secularism also always maintained Christianity as a state religion. Even today, most of the so called secular countries in the West, especially in Western Europe, even today they have, if you leave out France, if you look at England, they have Christianity as a state religion. The queen is the king is the head of the Anglican Church. So what happens is that the West uses this term secularism in the context of India to achieve certain goals, certain political goals, certain hegemonic goals, certain imperial goals. Imperialism may have gone away, but they try to control India and other countries, other developing countries mostly, or the erstwhile colonized countries, through the means of human rights, secularism, and so many other tropes that they throw at us.
Would you say then that secularism, the adding of the word secular in our constitution through the amendment, would you say it was an afterthought? It was purely a political tool? Is that what we're coming to?
Well, it was
That
done to appease the Soviet Union at that time. Basically, Soviet Union wanted this done, and Indira Ji was too beholden to Soviet Union to say that okay, in any case, what difference does it make? But it has had a deleterious effect in the sense that secularism in India, after that insertion of that word, basically come to mean anti-Hindu in this country. So whenever anybody says that I'm secular, basically what he means is that he is anti-Hindu. That is the practical effect that we are watching today. Whereas there is nothing more equality loving religion or faith than Sanatan Dharma. Our basics, if you even look at the Bhagavad Gita, Samam Sarveshu Bhuteshu, Tishtantam Parameshwaram. That even Parameshwar resides equally in every being, animate or inanimate. So it is much larger than just equality among human beings. It's equality among all beings, and not just all living beings. even inanimate beings. So the principle of equality in Sanatan Dharma is so expansive that the West cannot venture anywhere near it. So it was completely unnecessary here. And then by using this, because it has been intrinsic to our living existence, then by conflating it, especially all these leftist ideologues, by conflating it with the Western style separation of church and the state, they have developed what is called anti Hindu ideologies and anti Hindu narratives. So it has actually benefited the left, the old Marxist variety and the new postmodernist variety, even the liberalist variety. All of them have been benefited in that sense, and Hindus have been made to feel apologetic about it. That has been the net effect of that. And now, of course, it is coming apart because people have woken up to it. And even though the state still pays lip service to it, but then uh, I think the social media revolution that has taken place all over the world, and more so even in India, I think we are getting wiser to what the insertion of this word has done to us.
Sanjay ji, one more question, which it's a slight maybe a deviation from what we're discussing here. But would you say that the definition of dharma then in Sanatan Dharma, would you say that it is a very dynamic concept, and through the yugs and through the ages, it has the Maryada Purushottam, so to say, who defines dharma, uh, if he emulates or he embodies dharma as per the requirements of the particular yog. So, what is the scope of reform or social reform according to the requirements of the time in various religions that prevail today? I know you wouldn't want to call Sanatan Dharma a religion, but for the lack of a better word, um,
No, no.
what
When I talk to the Westerners, I always call it a religion because otherwise they get confused. They don't know how to respond. So when talking to the West, then you have to call it a religion, yeah, just because because of their non-familiarity with any other word. Dharma, of course, is a dynamic. But then when you define them, again, when you talk to me, what are the essentials? Then I say that if you talk to an Advaitin, he will give you a different concept. When you talk to a Advaitin, he will give you a different concept. When you talk to an Arya Samaji, he will sound like, almost sound like an Abrahamic. We talk to ISKCON guys, they also, they have element of Abrahamism. But then there are four things that are common to almost everybody. Why almost to everybody? The concept of the dharma, karma, sansara, and moksha. These are the common values that every sampradaya in Bharatavarsha or every Sanatana sampradaya holds. And what is dharma is to uphold these values. What are these values? So when we say sansara, sansarati iti sansara, that is the very basic of Sanatana Dharma. Sansarati iti sansara means the time is infinite. That's one that goes on all the time is sansara. Sansarati iti sansara. So you have to distinguish from the other religion. Basically, your time concept is infinite, unlike the last judgment concept of the Abrahamic religions. Then your logic concept is very diverse. It is multi-valued. It is not shades of black and white. It is not based on the proof that is there in the book. Whatever there is there in the book is the final proof. What the other religions would say. So, when we talk about dharma, so of course, and I said four, dharma is actually the sum total as well as the quintessence of all these. So, if you take away the time concept, of then the karma concept will go away. Why? Because if you do not have the infinite time, then there cannot be a rebirth. And if there cannot be a rebirth, then how do you get the karma concept into it? If you do not get the uh, uh, sansara concept, and if you do not get the karma concept, then how do you get the moksha concept into it? There's no liberation. If there is no infinite time, then there's no liberation, no concept of liberation. So when you talk about the dharma, then dharma is not just the code that you follow. Dharma, in fact, I have defined it fairly elaborate manner in my Krishna books. What exactly is dharma? Because uh, dharma can be relative to your situation. So Raj Dharma and Rashtra Dharma may be different in different contexts. So dharma becomes contextual, but dharma has to uphold the sansara, the karma, and the moksha concepts. That is my definition.
All right, that's beautiful, I would say, and it's I mean, it throws a lot of light on what we're trying to understand here in terms of reforms. Like you said that dharma is it's a relative concept, uh, while still holding some element of absolutism.
Let me explain it to you. You talked about
Yes.
the difference between Rama and Krishna. Again, I'm writing a trilogy. I've already written 2 books on it, and from the mouth of Krishna, I have got it voiced a number of times as to what is your dharma in front of a cruel marauder. What is hinsa? What is ahimsa? Is it a dharma to kill someone who, if not killed, will probably kill a million people? And it is very well explained in the Bhagavad Gita itself, 18.17. Yasya nahang krito bhavo buddhir yasya na lipyate hatva sa iman lokan nahanti na nipadhyate. That is, to kill someone to uphold dharma is actually the greatest dharma. Unlike Gandhi, and it said, yes, nahang krito bhava, that you are doing that without involvement of ego in it. And if you have an involvement of ego and you are not killing physically, you are actually committing violence, as Gandhi used to commit. When he used to do these satyagrahas, that's it, out of his ego, he used to force, okay, I want this outcome, so I will go unto a fast and I will force my view onto somebody. So forcing your view onto somebody through the means of even what is called physical non-violence is pure violence in terms of Bhagavad Gita.
Yeah.
So you have to understand it in this manner that it and that is where Vivek comes in. All understanding of Sanatana Dharma comes through Vivek, Mir Shir Vivek. Yeah.
Right. Which is again, of course, Vivek, what distinguishes human beings from any other living being. So, Sanjay, I would now want to ask you this that in terms of reforms and the incorporation of reforms in religious practices, there has recently been news that the Iranian government is planning to use facial recognition technology on public transport to identify women who are not complying with a strict new law on wearing the hijab, as the regime continues its increasingly punitive crackdown on women's dress code. What are your thoughts on this, Sanjay ji?
Of course, it is draconian, but if you really go strictly according to the Quran, they're not even supposed to take photographs, but then they do, because Islam has this great virtue of being totally in favor of the rulers. And the rulers, according to their convenience, keep defining it. And of course, you have this great principle of what is called taqleed in Islam. And taqleed means that you copy the great scholars. You don't have any other option, because if you don't copy, if you don't do taqleed of the alim or the ulama, then you go to hell. So anything that you do, that you are actually condemned to eternal hell. So that eternal hell is a great, uh, I think, a great factor that regiments the Islamic societies. That fear of eternal hell, and the fear, of course, is always there. Unlike Sanatana Dharma, the Abrahamic societies work on fear. You are supposed to fear Allah. You're supposed to fear God. That fear is not a factor here in Sanatana Dharma. You're supposed to uh, love God. God is supposed to love you. There, you're supposed to be Allah's slave, and you're supposed to fear Him. That's a very important distinction, and that's what mm, lends it to misuse by the people who are in power. So they define it the way they want, and you are supposed to do the taqleed, that is imitation of what they tell you, and that is supposed to be part of the theology.
Right. Uh, that's again very insightful, Sanjay ji. Thank you. So, so would you say that practices, religious practices, which are not in line with the constitutional principles, they cannot, can they ultimately be afforded any kind of protection, especially if they're not taking into account reforms that have to come along with the passage of time?
They can be. The state has the power to enact laws, but the state is uh, very, very timid, and they don't do it. In fact, Article 25(2) gives them full power, as I told you, to enact legislation for social reform,
Right.
and to enact legislation in the forms of, in areas of uh, what is called economic and such things, uh, which basically are not essential part of religion. They have full power to enact the laws. But what they do is that they leave it to the courts, and the courts are supposed to test it, test a law on the anvil of these fundamental rights. They are not supposed to enact laws. But then the states have been remiss in this. It's not as if the state cannot enact a law that prohibits all kind of these external uh, clothings. They can enact a law. The Karnataka government did that. In fact, that is the challenge. The challenge is to that particular rule, which the Karnataka government brought in. And that challenge stands because it is supposed to be uh, what is called uh, in accordance with the exceptions that are provided. The exceptions or the subjections that are provided, as I said, subject to morality, health, and subject and public order, and to other fundamental rights. And they are being saved only on that account. But the state has full power to enact laws under Article 25.
Right.
Laws for social reform as well. If they want, they can bring in laws to reform Muslim society, to reform Christian practices, just as they have done for Hindus. They've done that for Hindus, but they have not done for Muslims and Christians.
Right. Right. So, Sanjay ji, I mean, thank you so much for pointing out the absurdity then in the practice of using law in the case of, for instance, the Iranian government, where they're using law as a tool to enforce a regressive practice, and enlightening us about the fact that here in India, we do have a tool, which is Article 25, to bring in laws that reform personal laws rather than take them into a mode of regression. Thank you so much for throwing light on that very, very important point. The next question I want to ask you, Sanjay ji, is that continuing on the same line of thought, that would you please like to educate our viewers in simple words as to what exactly is the Uniform Civil Code? And do you think that it should be adopted in a religiously diverse and rich society like Bharat?
Actually, there's a huge amount of confusion as far as Uniform Civil Code is concerned, because Uniform Civil Code is not one law. Uniform Civil Code basically means uniform principles. For example, uniform principle is that if the question, we are basically talking about personal laws, and sometimes it is talked about that okay, the Goa Civil Code is uniform. The Goa Civil Code is basically a Christian law. Goa Civil Code was brought in by the Portuguese government, I think in the year 1867 or something. And it is basically a Christian law. And when it comes to personal laws, then it has completely different bearing on different uh, communities. A uniform civil code means uniform principles in the matter of marriage and divorce, one, then inheritance, guardianship, and adoption. These are the basic four facets of the Uniform Civil Code. And you can always bring in uniform principles without really bearing on the nitty gritty or the details. For instance, if a divorce has to take place, the simple universal principle will be that it has to go through a court. It doesn't have to be on the whim of a qazi or on the whim of some scholar. And then the regressive practices like halala, like unequal forms of talaq, they have to go away. Just like in the Hindu code bill, we have a situation where rights for men and women are equal. So you can define a principle where men and women have equal right. For adoption, you can enunciate a principle that everybody can adopt. The Muslims today cannot adopt because of their own personal law. Similarly, for guardianship, you lay down uniform principles. And after that, once you have uniform principles, then different laws can be made.
Thank you so much, Sanjay ji, for joining us today and enlightening us about the various aspects of the hijab controversy in the Karnataka High Court as well as the Supreme Court. Through the course of the talk, you have talked about how there are no verses in the Quran that even mention the word hijab. You have described for us what an essential religious practice actually constitutes as per law. And you have also gone into how Dharma as a concept is very, very dynamic and it's very, very relative. Through the times, it has always been a relative concept. So the question of reform is very much inherent and inbuilt into the question of religious practices and of dharma in general. Further, you have also thrown light on a closing note about what exactly is the Uniform Civil Code for the understanding of our viewers and how the protection of essential religious practices or to what extent it can be permitted within the scope of a constitutional democracy and a secular setup like Bharat. I thank you, Sanjay ji, from the bottom of my heart for taking time out to join us today and talking about all of these issues in such a beautiful, simple, and eloquent language. Thank you so much. Namaste. And thank you from all my heart for joining us today on behalf of Chiti Media. Thank you, Sanjay ji. Namaste.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.